The fire hose of news from America can feel like a lot these days.
If you're trying to figure out what to make of it all, we got you.
I'm Katie Simpson.
And I'm Paul Hunter. We're correspondents here in Washington,
working just around the corner from where much of the action is taking place.
2 blocks from the White House.
And that's the name of our new podcast.
For top-notch analysis of U.S. politics from a Canadian perspective, find 2 blocks from the White House every Wednesday wherever you get your podcasts,
including YouTube.
Hey, it's Caryn. Today's episode includes themes of suicide and gun violence. Please take care.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It was just a normal day. Families in a picturesque town in the shadow of BC's Rocky Mountains sending their kids off to school. But some will never come home. Shock, devastation, and grief are reverberating across the country after an 18-year-old killed her mother and stepbrother before opening fire on the town's high school, where many young lives were lost before the shooter turned the gun on herself. The shooter was born as a biological male, but began transitioning into a female 6 years ago. As the tight-knit community struggles to come to grips with the unfathomable, so much is still unknown, including what motivated the suspect to carry out the murder spree, one of the worst in Canadian history. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, we're digging into this tragedy that has rocked our country more than we could ever imagine. I'm joined by former RCMP major crimes investigator Bruce Pitt-Payne to discuss the questions left in the wake of the deadliest attack at a Canadian school in nearly 40 years, and how investigators will attempt to answer them. Bruce, thank you so much for making time for us under really horrific circumstances. We do appreciate it.
You're welcome.
First and foremost, you live in BC. You're familiar with the kind of close-knit community that has now been struck by unspeakable tragedy. Just how deeply are you feeling this?
I'm feeling it very deeply, and it's not just because I've worked in small towns, but I know what it's like myself to be involved in a violent situation that, but by the grace of God, it would have ended up where we were all killed as well. And it was a hostage taking in a small town that I was policing in a hospital with somebody with an assault rifle. So that could have gone sideways. 8 people could have died that night. When I heard about this, it immediately took me back to the state of holy cow, it's real. And yeah, it was very visceral when I heard about this yesterday.
Yeah, I can't begin to imagine what it is like for police to enter that school, find 6 victims dead, the body of the shooter, others critically injured. Most of these are very young victims. What's going through your mind as an officer, and how do you even start to absorb that kind of horrific scene?
Well, the first thing I think is when the officers go in there, they go into autopilot, which is translated as courage, because they're going to be scared knowing there's an active shooter, but they follow their training and they go in, and that's what they did. They didn't sit outside and wait. That's not what happens. They went in, and then the secondary part hits, which is how horrible the nature of this was. And this will be with these officers for the rest of their lives.
I find it pretty remarkable, too, that there were 5 members of this tiny RCMP detachment in Tumbler Ridge. They're being credited, as you say, with saving lives during the attack. The BC Premier said they responded to the school within 2 minutes. I mean, just how remarkable is that?
That's extremely remarkable. And I was saying to somebody else this morning that being a small community with a relatively small size police force that is there in that detachment, it has its pros and cons. Like, the cons are that they usually don't have the bodies to do a lot of the work, so they don't have specialty units at their beck and call. So they learn to become very resilient and do it themselves. The good side of this, the pro, is they got there very quickly. They probably were not far from that to begin with, but it just shows that within a couple of minutes, they would have gone in there. They wouldn't have just gone and sat around. They put themselves at extreme risk while shots were still being heard.
Do you have any connections to that community or to the law enforcement there?
Not to Tumbler Ridge itself, but to Fort St. John. And I've worked with a lot of members. I don't know who's there right now, but I've worked with a lot of members that have done that northern posting and are still there.
I wonder what happens now. I mean, we know that the investigation itself is still in the very early stages, but could you possibly, walk us through what an investigation of this scale could look like?
Sure. It's going to be extremely intense. And I know a lot of people think that because the shooter is dead, that they don't need an investigation, but it's required regardless. So there's actually going to be 3 prongs probably. And definitely there will be a coroner's investigation, and they have a mandate and a memo of understanding to work with the police. But if the police are looking at a criminal investigation or want to use it for that, they can't do what we call piggyback off the coroner. So the coroner can get information because of their role. They don't need authorities under the criminal code in the same way the police do, because it's not something that they're looking to incriminate somebody. They're trying to figure things out. So the police will do their own. That's the second prong. And if they need information off the coroner, they have to actually get a warrant to get that if it's a piece of physical evidence, for instance. So they work together, but not together, if that makes sense. The police still must do a thorough, complete investigation. They will do everything that they would have done, except obviously interview the suspect and do things like that, wiretaps, all of those things that would be up to them before in a regular murder investigation. Those are the only things that would be left out. Everybody else will still be interviewed. All of the physical evidence, all of the online presence, all of that sort of information will still be gathered so they can figure out what happened and why it happened. And it could then go over to the coroner's investigation or a coroner's inquest if one is held. The other third prong is, and I haven't heard whether they're involved. We don't know enough right now for us to understand or make a call. But the Independent Investigations Office, the IIO, the Independent Oversight Agency for death or serious bodily harm in relation to police involvement, either their action or inaction, is another possibility. And that could be a third prong here. But I'm going to give you an example of why they can't just say, the police, we don't need to investigate because it's not going to charges. Even though they do not investigate civil matters, this could end up in a lawsuit. For some reason, somebody could sue somebody else, and that information would be needed from the police still. The other thing is that even though they said there was not a second shooter, they've ruled that out. You never know, for instance, with status of guns, whether they are registered, whether they are legal, whether they were stored properly. These are all aspects that the police must look at in follow-up in the same way they did out in Nova Scotia for the mass casualty situation out there. So they've got a lot of work to do. It's just they won't send in a package to the prosecutor saying, will you approve charges? That's the only difference.
There are a few things I want to ask you about based on what you've just said, but let me pick up on the possible motive,
Yes.
because RCMP have said, they're not in a place at this point in the investigation to understand what motivated the shooter. You've laid out, what kind of clues they'll still be looking for to determine that motive. But I just wonder if it is possible to ever truly know why this happened when the shooter herself can't speak to it.
The probably the only way to know for sure is if the shooter left a message somewhere on some social media platform. If the shooter told somebody else, sent a message, anything like that, or left a note, those sort of things could indicate the motive here. Otherwise, it would be speculative. What the RCMP probably will do, and I'm just guessing here, is they do have behavioral sciences sections. There's one in British Columbia, a very prolific one, that also has access to operational psychologists, so forensic psychologists, and they may do what's called a psychological autopsy of the shooter to see what they can find out from other sources, or the regular police would find that, turn it over, and the assessment would be done with that information. That's done quite often when the shooter ends their life in a suicide.
Police did say that they visited the shooter's home several times for mental health issues. They say the suspect had been apprehended and taken for a health assessment more than once. How will it be determined that nothing was overlooked when police, for instance, last visited the home of the suspect in the spring for mental health issues? They say that included at that time self-harm.
Well, I would think that the RCMP would look into that as well, first off. But this is the benefit of possibly having the coroner involved, which is independent, and mainly the IIO, the Independent Investigations Office. I know recently there was a case where I believe the IIO was called to look at a domestic violence situation, an intimate partner violence situation in BC, where they were asked, was possible police inaction responsible for the later murder? So the police had that involvement with the suspect, with the eventual victim, and did they do everything that they should have done? Was there something they could have done better? And the IIO would look for possible situations of neglect, negligence, for instance, if that would exist, and propose a charge, or ask, actually, they don't propose the charge, they would forward a proposal or a recommendation or a suggestion for review to Crown, who would have the final decision. So that may be an option because they look at inaction or cases of supposed inaction as well.
How long might something like that take? Like, do you have an expected timeline? Just, how long the community might be waiting for answers?
Well, the IIO, if they're going to be called out, would be called out very quickly because they will do their own investigation. They will seize and use evidence seized by the police in their own investigation. They will have full access to all of that, but they will do their own interviews and such and try and look at their focus more than what the police, or in a different way than what the police would be looking at. A timeline, the IIO has become remarkably faster than when they first started a few years ago, but it still takes a while, in a matter of a year or more before they would be expected to have some sort of a decision.
I want to go back to 2020. When the RCMP faced immense criticism for their failures in the response to what is now the worst mass shooting in Canadian history in Portapique. It led to calls for dramatic reforms. And is there anything, in your assessment that police have learned from what happened in Portapique that they can now employ in this investigation?
Yeah, and from the surface view that we all are getting right now, I can point out a few things where I think there's been drastic improvement since Portapique. So the Mass Casualty Commission looked at transparency of the police in their communications with journalists, with the media, with community groups and such. So that, when I was watching the particularly Dwayne McDonald speaking today, there was a lot of information given out that I guarantee 15 years ago would not have been given out. And I said this earlier to somebody, is when the police mention something and they're trying to be nice and they're trying to give out a lot of information to appease critics, they run the risk of actually being accused of making mistakes. And I think that if we're going to ask for that information during what is organized chaos, there's no other way to explain it, then we should also accept the fact that they will make mistakes with names. And I know one of the situations was they thought that a person had been deceased. They had a higher number count, and thank God that person is still alive. But those sort of things, they could be criticized for it when we asked them to actually rush the job a little bit. So I'm going to say that they've learned from that. They sure learned on the broadcast and the lockdown, err on the side of caution. They've learned about active shooter, how to get in there and stop it and such. And I'm going to say from the surface, unless somebody were to show me something otherwise, I think they did a bang-up job.
I have to say, I too was quite surprised by the amount of information that we got from the latest update from RCMP and the amount that was revealed publicly. But as you say, it is a fine line. Do you think they run the risk here of having, revealed too much too soon?
There's always that risk. And that's why, the old way of doing things was we aren't going to say much, and then we can't be called on it. Now they're being called on it, or they were in the Mass Casualty Commission, because some things could be released. But you never know the value of that information you're releasing quite often until later on. So it could be a month down the road and somebody goes, "Ooh, you shouldn't release that information." Well, we can't have our cake and eat it too sometimes. So I think we have to accept this. I know the players involved here, the RCMP people, they are solid. They do not want to. Dwayne McDonald or Ken from Prince George in the first interview, they do not want to hold back information. If they do, it's because they have to. So I think we're seeing a transition right now where there are going to be mistakes made, but I think we have to go a little easier on the police when they do make those mistakes, when we're asking them to.
If you were an investigator on this case, Bruce, what would keep you up at night?
Everything about it. I was up last night and I'm not even the investigator on the case. I'll be honest with you here. I left an interview yesterday where it was announced mid-interview how many people were killed and injured. And I went from being extremely high that it was just the shooter that was deceased to demolished. And I walked downstairs and I broke into tears. And the last time that happened was Mayerthorpe, when I heard that 4 of my colleagues were murdered. This one is very visceral. I am so glad I'm retired because I can get over this. The half-life will be so short for me to do some breathing and all the things I've learned about PTSD in the past. The members right now, I like to think it's a better world for police officers that walk into these things. But you can't erase the trauma. You can't erase that. You can learn to cope in a good way. So my thoughts are, and it's not to diminish my thoughts of the family members and the survivors and everybody else in that community, but I can relate to the police officers better than anybody else in that community. And I don't know how they're going to ever be the same.
Do you have a message for people who might be, feeling the same way as you are, but unable to digest it in the ways that you can, because as you say, you're in a very unique position in that you can actually relate to what law enforcement and the wider community in that BC town are feeling. What would be your message to other people just trying to digest what's happened in our country?
Yeah, I would say a few things that come to mind. Number one is don't ever let anybody invalidate your feelings. If you're feeling messed up over this, you earn the right as a member of that community or a police force to feel messed up about this. There's nothing wrong with it. What hurts you is when you bottle it up and you think you can handle it. And I sort of go, it's like drips of water filling up your bucket, and eventually it just flows over the top. The other thing is that I've seen a lot of hatred coming from this. Everybody likes to blame something. And I'm not an expert on people that are trans by any means, but I've seen a lot of anger that I think is probably misplaced here towards the trans community and mental health in general, and really conflating the issues. You've got to remember, this is an individual, and we can't demonize groups of people. And I know that's not a police role for me to say that, but as a Canadian, the worst thing that we could learn from this is how to hurt more people. It's an individual, and an individual that may have been going through individual problems that we can't even fathom. That's not an excuse, but it's humanity. That's the biggest message I would love to send here.
Bruce, appreciate your insight today and for sharing that message with us. At the end of the day, we're all human. Bruce, thank you. And that was the big story. This was a hard conversation to have as a journalist, and I'm sure it was for you to hear as a listener. We've included some resources in today's show notes. Please take care. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks for listening.